Today I'm going to lift the front of this FJ Cruiser with 5100 Bilstein shocks. Stock one of your rear wheels. Start by breaking free all the nuts on the wheels. You'll need a 21mm socket. Here's a diagram showing all the jacking points and support positions. The recommended jack point is right here on this cross member. Don't use a book, use a piece of wood, as the pages can slip in between. Once both wheels are off the ground, place your jack stands. The vehicle jacked up is a little bit too tall for my jack stands for this position here, so I'm going to put them right here underneath this cross member. Once you have two jack stands in place, slowly lower the car onto the jack stand. Leave your jack just in case for a third point of contact. Remove your lug nuts and your front wheels. Spray down all the fasteners that you're going to remove with some sort of liquid wrench or blaster. That'll loosen those up, get some of the rust off before we start cranking on these. I recommend you remove the complete strut assembly, take it to a shop, and have them use a spring compressor in order to replace your struts with the Bilstein 5100. Nevertheless, I'm going to disassemble the spring and strut assembly on the car itself and reassemble it while it's on the car as well. Do this at your own risk. Jack about an inch up on your lower control arm, so you're compressing the spring just slightly. With the jack under the lower control arm, we're going to remove these two screws holding the steering knuckle to the lower control arm. Use a 19mm socket to remove these. Mark here, aligned with a little alignment mark, so that when you retighten these, it'll be right back where it's supposed to be. Mark this one as well. Now loosen the lower control arm bolt using a 19mm socket. On the rear leg of the lower control arm, loosen this nut on the back with a 19mm socket. Making absolutely certain that your lower control arm is fully supported by this jack, move up here to the top of your strut to this stud, and you're going to remove this nut with a 17mm ratcheting wrench. Hold the top of the stud with some sort of crescent wrench. Your tools should look like this when removing that nut. I was able to break the nut free after quite a bit of effort. However, on the right-hand side of the car, when I did the same operation, I actually had to drill the nut off. I'll show the result in the next clip. Well, unfortunately, the little nut on the stud wouldn't come off easily. So what we had to do, we were holding on to the top of the stud, and that snapped off. And then we still couldn't get the nut off of the stud. So ultimately, we drilled through it until we were all the way through the stud itself, and then it just snapped right off. With the nut removed, start to lower this jack. If the stud does not lower with the jack, it means that the washer on the top of the bushing has likely corroded onto the stud. Put the jack back and then grab the washer with a pair of pliers and rotate that washer until it breaks free. All right, dropping it down now. There it comes. Now we're going to have to use a little bit of torque in order to pull this control arm down a little bit so we can get the entire strut out. I'm going to put it between the bump stop and the lower control arm. I'm just going to lift straight up, and that should pull it straight out. Okay, once it's to that point, we can remove the bolt that attaches the strut to the lower control arm, and we'll pull that strut completely out. Use a 19mm socket to remove this nut. After removing the nut and washer, gently tap out this bolt. It was a lot of work, but we finally got the strut out, and all we need from this is just this spring here. Choose which slot you want this spring to be at. If you're at the neutral position, this basically gives you no lift, all the way up to 2.5 inches of lift. I'm going to put it at 2.5 inches. Make sure that's fully seated all the way around. Remove this little plastic keeper. Then we're going to also remove this shield. We'll replace that in just a moment. And we're going to place the cup down like this. That way it captures this ring and does not allow that to move. It's captured inside of here. Do pay attention to that orientation. If you do it wrong, it will definitely give you quite the lift and it won't work very well. Put this on here. There's two big washers in here. One is larger than the other. The smaller one goes on first. So he's going to go with the cup facing up, We're gonna set him right like that. Now we're gonna put the spring on top of this, and then we're gonna reinsert it into the truck. Make sure the spring seats properly down here in the little catch. And we're going to reinsert this the way we pulled the other one out, and that is we're gonna put a crowbar, or in this particular case, a lever arm underneath the bumper stop. And we're gonna lift up so it drops that lower control arm, which will give me enough room to slide this into its little slot, and also put this stud up through the center of the top hat. Make sure that the rubber bushing that was originally with the vehicle is still attached up here, and you're gonna make sure that the marking matches the spring at the top. Your cams might be a bit frozen, so take a 26mm impact wrench, rotate it a little bit. Also on the other side, I used a 19mm and then just a really long wrench handle to try to get that loose. Once those go down, it's a lot easier to drop the control arm low enough so they can get this new Bilstein shock in. Jack up this lower control arm and watch. Make sure the stud goes straight up through the hole. I'll put this new rubber bushing on the stud. And make sure it goes into the top hat a little ways so you can get the washer on top of it. Put on your new washer with the cup side down. And place the nut on the stud and screw it on. Replace the lower shock bolt along with its nut and washer, and torque to 100 foot-pounds. Replace the 2 screws on the bottom of this ball joint and torque them to 118 foot-pounds. You may need to jack up the lower suspension in order to make that work. Use an 18mm ratcheting wrench to tighten this down to 20 foot-pounds of torque. Use a crescent wrench to keep the top from spinning, just like how we removed the nut. Adjust your cam marks to where they started, and then tighten the bolt and nut to 100 foot-pounds on each the front and the rear of this lower control arm. Replace your wheel and snug up the lug nuts. Then do this entire process on the other side of the car. Then jack up your vehicle a little bit more and remove your jack stands and let the vehicle down to the floor. Torque your lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. Front right, 37 inches. Rear right, 36.5 inches. Left front, 36 3/4 inches. Left rear, 36 1/4 inches. All right, this is how it looks with that front suspension lift in at 2.5 inches on the Bilstein 5100s. 4th slot up. I'll measure the actual height from the ground to the top of the fender well. After this, I'm gonna go and put a rear lift in, an Icon Overlander spring set, along with an Ironman shock absorber.